Hi, I'm Jasmine Fledderjohann, and today I'd like to talk about food insecurity as a pressing matter of reproductive justice. The work I'd like to present today is part of a collaboration between myself. I'm based at the Department of Sociology at Lancaster University, and I'm the principal investigator for the Food Security for Equitable Futures project. I'm working with Sophie Patterson, who is also based here at Lancaster. She's in the Faculty of Health and Medicine, and she also has an appointment at Simon Fraser University in the Faculty of Health Sciences. And our collaborator, Maureen Owino, she's based at the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Urban Health at York University in Canada. So to begin, I'd like to talk just a little bit about reproductive justice. So reproductive justice is a movement that was started by Black feminist activists working in the United States in 1994. It's a really helpful analytic tool for understanding reproductive oppression, but really important, it's an analytic tool that stems from this movement, right? It's been driven by Black feminist activists. And they articulate three core rights that are fundamental reproductive rights. So the right to not have a child, and a lot of the reproductive rights activism that was going on in the mid-1990s was focused on this right not to have a child, particularly on abortion care, accessing abortion care, and contraception. And reproductive justice activists argue that yes, this is hugely important, this is absolutely a fundamental right, but it's not the only right. And a lot of the activism that was happening at the time, reproductive health activism and reproductive rights activism that was happening at the time, was really narrowly focused on this concern, which is disproportionately a middle-class white woman's concern. And they said, in fact, actually, the right to have a child is also incredibly important and is not being picked up by existing reproductive rights movements. And likewise, the right to parent with dignity in safe and healthy environments. And the reason that these rights of the right to have a child and to parent with dignity in safe and healthy environments are so important to bring into this discussion is because they were being left out, but they actually reflect oppressions that have been experienced disproportionately by marginalized people. So having your child taken away from you by the state, experiencing forced sterilization, eugenics programs, these are all oppressions that have disproportionately impacted, for example, Black Americans, queer Americans, and beyond the US as well, but obviously this was a movement that started in the US. So there are three core rights, not just to have a child, but also to not have a child and to parent with dignity in safe and healthy environments. And all of those rights matter within the reproductive justice framework. So reproductive justice is this really broad umbrella that covers a lot of different areas of justice and a lot of different oppressions. It takes a really long lens on history and how we've got to the structural systems that we have in place today that continue to oppress some people more than others. So some examples are environmental justice, right? Access to abortion, of course, but also immigration justice, paid leave, disability justice, racial justice, ending incarceration, decolonization. There's a really wide range of issues that are included within reproductive justice because these all have consequences for those three rights: to have a child, to not have a child, and to parent with dignity in safe and healthy environments. And today I want to focus on just one piece of that, which is food security. So food security is also part of reproductive justice. So food security is having access at all times to enough safe and nutritious food to support a healthy and active life. Food insecurity is just the inverse of that. So food insecurity, we argue in our research, is a threat to reproductive justice in a wide variety of ways, and we'll get into that a little bit today. So food insecurity involves difficulties accessing enough safe and nutritious food to support a healthy life. It can include the inability to afford food. It can also include lack of local availability. So even if I have the financial resources to afford food, there might not be food available or healthy food available to me in my area. One obvious example that a lot of people are familiar with by now was the supply chain shortages during COVID. So we saw a lot of supply chain issues and food shortages in local areas. So even if I have the resources, there might not be local availability. I might have inconsistent access over time, so there might be times when I can afford food and other times when I can't, or times when food is readily available and other times when it's not. And food insecurity it can include things like skipping meals or going without food altogether for an entire day, for example. But it might also include things like worrying about food access. So even if I actually technically have access to food, I might still be worried about that access. It might be really tenuous access. So all of these things are part of food insecurity and what we're talking about today. And we know from previous research that some people face a greater risk, some people face a much greater risk of food insecurity than others. So I'm going to focus in on the UK because this is part of a talk for the Repro North group, and we're focused particularly on reproductive health issues in the northwest of England. But what I'm going to say is actually true globally, right? Some people face a much greater risk of food insecurity than others. And a lot of the groups that I'll talk about in the context of the UK also experience a greater risk of food insecurity elsewhere in the world. So racially marginalized people, women, people in low-income households, people with disabilities, transgender and gender non-conforming people, people who are living with HIV, people who are living without homes, and lone parent households are all groups that experience a greater risk of food insecurity. And if you look at the map on the right here, you can see that there's also geographic patterning in the UK as to who experiences the greatest risk of food insecurity. So part of why I wanted to give this talk at this Repro North event at ReproFest is because, as you can see here from the areas that are listed in yellow, the highest percent of households that are food insecure in the UK are in the northeast and the northwest. So this is a particularly pressing problem here in the northwest of England. And we know that food insecurity is not just a problem of the pandemic. So we've seen a real increase in coverage of food insecurity and awareness about food insecurity since the pandemic. But food insecurity is a social problem that long predates the pandemic. So if we look just in the year prior to the pandemic, if we look at 2019, we know that lone adult households with children reported the highest levels of food insecurity. So 26% of lone adult households, single parent households that had one children, 26%, over a quarter of those households experienced food insecurity in 2019. 28% of lone adult households with two children experience food insecurity, and 41% of those with 3 or more children experience food insecurity. So this is a staggering issue, particularly among lone adult households, right? These are really huge percentages. And this has only been compounded since the pandemic. So if we think about just the period between August 2020 and January 2021, so this is a really short 6-month window that we're talking about. Just between August 2020 and January 2021, the Food Foundation estimates that 4.7 million adults in the UK experience food insecurity. And 2.3 million children in the UK experience food insecurity in that same window. So this is a huge pressing problem, one that predated the pandemic, but has certainly been exacerbated by the pandemic as well. And this is problematic for a range of reasons, not least of which is that food is a human right. So in 1948, the United Nations created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UK signaled their commitment to the rights that were articulated in that document in 1976 when they signed the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. There's been a lot of further writing and thinking about human rights that's really helped to hone how we think about the right to food and other rights as well, that's been led by the UN. Particularly importantly, they clarified on the right to food in 1999. So there's this Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And they said in a document in 1999 that the right to adequate food is indivisibly linked to the inherent dignity of the human person and is indispensable for the fulfillment of other human rights. It's also inseparable from social justice, and it requires the adoption of appropriate social policies oriented to the eradication of poverty and the fulfillment of human rights for all. So they're saying that our human right to food is absolutely linked to our other human rights. You can't have one right fulfilled and other rights neglected, right? We have to think about the way that different rights are connected. And these rights are inherent to our dignity, right? Our dignity as humans. And they argue that the state, right, the government has a role, a very important responsibility in that they have to adopt policies that eradicate poverty and help to realize all of these human rights for all people within their jurisdiction. But we know that food insecurity continues to be a large-scale problem. And we argue in our paper that food insecurity leaves people to face choiceless choices. We take this language of choiceless choices from Loretta Ross, who is a founding mother of Reproductive Justice. She's one of those Black feminist activists that I mentioned earlier in the talk, and her colleague Ricky Solinger. So they explain that society claims to offer this fantastic marketplace of reproductive options, right? You can decide which kind of contraception you want to use, if any. You can decide whether you want to use a doula or a midwife, or you want to have a hospital birth. There are all of these fantastic reproductive options. And society assumes that reproductive decision-making is really a simple matter of making a personal choice, right? So I just have to look at all of these different options in this marketplace of reproductive options and decide which options work for me. But really importantly, they point out that not everyone has access to the same choices. So there are some people who have been marginalized because of our social structures, right? We push some people to the margins of society, and they are left with fewer options, fewer choices. And in fact, they're left choosing between a range of undesirable options, right? So they have to choose between choiceless choices, a range of undesirable options. And those are disproportionately marginalized people who are left with these choiceless choices. So thinking about this in the context of reproductive justice and those three rights, the right to have a child, to not have a child, and to parent in safe and healthy environments, I'd like to talk a little bit more now about how food insecurity matters for each of those rights. So thinking first about the right to not have a child, food insecurity matters in part because food insecurity is associated with restricted sexual autonomy in partnerships. So people who experience food insecurity experience a greater risk of intimate partner violence. This can make it more difficult to leave violent relationships. If you're not sure where your next meal is coming from, it can be incredibly difficult to leave a violent relationship, particularly if that partner is using coercive control to keep you in the partnership. It can also make it more difficult to access and to use contraception. So for example, it can be really difficult to successfully ask a partner to use a condom when your partner is violent. And both difficulties leaving that relationship and difficulties accessing and using contraception can place people who are experiencing food insecurity at a greater risk of unwanted pregnancy. Additionally, food insecure people may need to turn to sexual relationships for material support. So relationships can provide money, they can also provide food and other material resources as well. But sexual relationships potentially carry with them a risk of pregnancy. And where those sexual relationships are criminalized, so for example, in many places, the UK included, sex work is criminalized, those activities can also carry with them the risk of incarceration. And once you've been incarcerated, it can be much more difficult to access reproductive health care, including accessing abortion care. So if you become pregnant and you're arrested for a criminalized activity, this can make it really difficult to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. And food insecurity creates choiceless spending choices. So in particular, there's research on the so-called treat or eat phenomenon. So the idea here is that you might have to make really difficult choiceless choices, right? Between spending money on food and spending money on accessing healthcare. And particularly within the context of the right to not have a child, this might matter particularly for abortion care costs. This might sound completely irrelevant in the UK, right? After all, we have the NHS, so there's free care available through the NHS in principle. But there are a couple of really important reasons why this continues to be a matter of concern, even with the NHS in place. So for one thing, the NHS is not actually free for everyone. For example, many migrant women cannot access free care through the NHS, and so may have to pay both for broad NHS fees and also potentially for specific reproductive health care, abortion in this case. Additionally, even for people who have access to free healthcare at the point of care through the NHS, there are still additional costs associated with accessing that care. So when we think about these, we call this the chain of care costs, building on Coast and her colleagues' work on abortion chain of care costs. So, for example, if I need to access an abortion, I might have to organize transportation, which has costs associated with it. I might lose wages if I have to miss a day or even several days of work. I might have a child or children already, and I might need to pay for childcare while I'm accessing care. It may also include employment opportunity costs, so particularly where we have a context of zero-hour contracts and tenuous employment, an employer may not be willing to give you time off and to enable you to go and seek an abortion, which means that you may be in a difficult position of choosing between a potential job loss and all of the lost wages and financial implications for your household and your ability to afford food versus carrying an unwanted pregnancy. So those are just a few of the ways that food insecurity might matter for the right to not have a child. And now I'd like to think a little bit more about how it might matter for the right to have a child. So first of all, food insecurity is associated with malnutrition. It's associated with caloric deficiencies, micronutrient deficiencies. And this matters for the right to have a child in part because malnutrition is linked to greater difficulty conceiving and also potentially to infertility. And malnutrition is a health risk throughout pregnancy, and this is true both for the mother and for the fetus and fetal development. Food insecurity is also relevant to this right because, again, food insecurity is associated with restricted sexual autonomy and partnerships. And along with that comes a greater risk of sexually transmitted infections, which are in turn a risk factor for infertility. And where food insecurity leads to entry into sexual relationships for material support, again, there's a potential risk of sexually transmitted infections and its implications for infertility. And also where relationships have been criminalized, relationships for material support have been criminalized, that again carries with it a risk of incarceration. While you're incarcerated, it's much more difficult to try to conceive, but also if you enter prison while pregnant, you're at risk of delivering in inhumane conditions, really horrifying conditions that no one wants to deliver in. For example, shackling during delivery, separation of newborns very soon after birth. So both in terms of inability to conceive and inability to deliver in humane conditions, food insecurity carries with it a real risk through the risk of incarceration. And again, here with the right to have a child, we also see the relevance of choiceless spending choices within the context of food insecurity. So those chain of care costs and the trade-off between chain of care costs and food spending matters not just in the context of abortion care, as we previously discussed, but also in the context of accessing other reproductive health care, such as antenatal care throughout pregnancy. We also know that food insecurity for some people is associated with postponement of fertility, particularly because it can be quite stressful, and worries about things like affording basic necessities can cause some people to think this is perhaps not the right time for family formation for me, potentially postponing family formation indefinitely. And we see this, for example, in the context of social protection cuts. So in the UK, the government introduced a 2-child policy limit in 2017 on access to social protection. And what this did was it limited financial support for families. So they could access financial support for their first 2 children, but for families that had more than 2 children, they were no longer able to access some of the financial support programs that they've been previously able to access in 2017. And this policy change has been shown to directly influence low-income women's decisions to have an abortion, right? So both in terms of conceiving, but also once you've conceived, potentially carrying that pregnancy to term, having that child, can be really strongly influenced by these choiceless spending choices that are associated with food insecurity. And then turning to that third right under the reproductive justice framework, the right to parent with dignity in safe and healthy environments. Food insecurity matters again because it's associated with malnutrition. And malnutrition is associated with worse birth outcomes up to and including death. Malnutrition matters for child survival, but also on growth throughout childhood, right? So we see an association between malnutrition and increased risk for children of diabetes, anemia, reduced immunity, right? So you might be more susceptible to other illnesses and less capable of fighting off other illnesses, micronutrient deficiencies, and these sorts of illnesses in childhood can have lasting effects throughout our entire lives. So nutrition is incredibly important for ensuring that children have healthy environments, safe and healthy environments that they can grow up in. Food insecurity is also associated with worse educational outcomes for children. So it turns out that nutrition is incredibly important for children's cognitive development. It's incredibly important for their ability to concentrate and focus in class and to be able to learn while they're at school. It also really matters for stigma and bullying. So children are really perceptive and they really understand when kids are experiencing financial hardship. And food insecurity has been shown to be associated with stigma and bullying for children, which can also make it incredibly difficult for them to want to be in school and to stay focused and engaged while they're in school. And there's research to show, perhaps unsurprisingly because of these previous 2 points, to show that food insecurity is associated with an increased risk of school dropout and lower educational attainment in the long term. And as we've already seen, food insecurity is also associated with entry into relationships for material support and difficulties leaving violent relationships. Obviously, growing up in a household with violence can have lasting implications, physical implications, emotional impacts, both for parents and for children. And where relationships, particularly those entered into for material support, are criminalized, it carries again that risk of incarceration. It's incredibly difficult, if not arguably impossible, to parent your children with dignity and to create safe and healthy environments for your children when you have been forcibly separated from your child. So obviously incarceration is a forcible separation of parents and children. And also after incarceration, many people also find it incredibly difficult to access housing and employment after release. So even after incarceration, it can be really difficult to provide a safe and healthy environment for children because of the stigma and because of the discrimination that people who have been incarcerated experience due to their history of incarceration. And then again here, we see the relevance of choiceless spending choices in the context of food insecurity. So we've talked a little bit previously about other ways that treat or eat might matter in this context. Very similarly, seeking healthcare for your child, right? If you have to take your child to the doctor, you might have to miss a day or a half day from work for that. That's lost wages. And that might mean choosing between taking your child to a doctor's appointment or putting food on the table. So really difficult, choiceless choices between spending on treatment and those chain of care costs associated with treatment versus food. We likewise see a phenomenon called heat or eat, where families might not have to make really difficult decisions between spending on food versus spending on energy costs, things like heating the home. And more broadly, on compromises between spending on food and spending on housing, right? So you might have to compromise on the quality of housing, live in neighborhoods that are less safe, live in housing that's less safe, in order to be able to continue to afford food. So really difficult, choiceless spending choices between food and other things in children's environments that matter to make those environments safe and healthy. And there's also some growing evidence around the way that parents spend on children's food and the way that might matter for tending after children's physical health versus their emotional well-being. So very often when we think about safe and healthy environments and what that means, the first thing that sort of comes to mind is physical well-being, physical health, right? Physical safety. But actually, emotional well-being matters as well, right? We need to tend after children's emotional well-being also. And so there's growing research to show that sometimes parents spend on what we might classify as unhealthy food, right? So-called unhealthy food items, because those are food items that children desire, because they're food items that they want to be able to share with their friends, because they're food items that keep children from feeling deprived and from feeling socially excluded. So parents might be in a really difficult decision, a really difficult situation where they have to make a decision, a choiceless choice between spending on healthier or less healthy items in order to tend after children's physical versus their emotional well-being. And that's particularly the case for marginalized parents, especially because there's also research to show that marginalized parents are more likely to be stigmatized for their food choices, even where they're making the same food choices as, for example, white middle-class parents, right? So there's literature in the US, for example, research from the US, for example, to show that Black parents are stigmatized for making the same sorts of choices that white parents are able to make without experiencing stigma. So really, really importantly, those choiceless choices can also impact on what specific food items parents are buying and what the implications of that are for their own experiences and their children's experiences of stigma and social exclusion. So what are the key conclusions from all of this? Well, first of all, I think it's very clear that basic human rights are not being adequately safeguarded in the UK, right? We can't have, 4.7 million adults and 2.3 million children experiencing food insecurity and claim that basic human rights are being adequately safeguarded. They're not. And we've seen here that those rights are indivisible, right? Human rights are an indivisible set of principles for ensuring human dignity and well-being. So we've seen throughout this talk that not meeting one right, in this case the right to food, is also having really important consequences, knock-on effects for other rights. And here we've looked at reproductive rights under the reproductive justice framework. And this really, I hope, helps to highlight the fact that rights can't be treated as a piecemeal project, because when we treat them as a piecemeal project, when we don't try to meet all of those rights for all people, real lives are affected in hugely consequential ways. And we've also seen that the risks are greatest for marginalized people, particularly multiply marginalized people. And so solidarity is really urgently needed if we're ever going to achieve human rights for all. And as well, policymakers and academics like myself need to listen to and work with, first of all, people with lived experience of the issues that we've talked about today, and also activists who are working to address these issues in real and meaningful ways. I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that none of the artwork on my slides here is mine. Almost all of it has come from Megan Smith's Repeal Hide art project. So I just want to acknowledge that beautiful artwork by Megan Smith. Thank you very much for your time. Please do feel free to get in contact if you have any questions or comments. I can be found at Food Equity or Fledderjohann1, and I've also listed the Twitter handles here for my colleagues as well. Thanks very much.